Stop for a moment, because what I'm about to lay out has been described by royal watchers as the biggest internal shift in the British monarchy since the abdication crisis back in 1936. King Charles III traveled all the way to the United States. He was only a short flight away from his own son, Prince Harry, and yet he did not go to see him. He didn't call. He didn't send someone in his place. And according to diplomatic reporting, he turned down repeated requests for a private meeting. That is not just a father and son failing to connect. In the eyes of many observers, that is a monarch drawing a firm line and making it clear that the line is not temporary. Think about that image for a second. Charles was in America. Harry was in America. The physical distance between them was small. But politically, symbolically, emotionally, it might as well have been an ocean. And when the king's plane left the country without even a hint of a Montecito stop, the signal was understood on both sides of the Atlantic. Harry was not being treated as someone the crown needed to prioritize. He was being treated as a private individual, separate from the machinery of the British state. Now imagine the atmosphere inside the Sussex household when that travel schedule became public. Picture the calls, the strategy conversations, the rush to interpret what it all meant. Picture the moment Harry's team realized that his father, a man dealing with serious health challenges, had chosen to use his limited time and energy on official responsibilities instead of a meeting with his son. That is not a diary issue. That is a decision. And once a decision like that is made so publicly, it is very hard to pretend it means nothing. Charles did not lack hours in the day. What many took from this was something far more serious. He no longer had the personal or institutional appetite to spend those hours on Harry. Palace aides would have understood that instantly. Senior advisors would have understood it too. So would royal staff in California. The message did not need to be spoken out loud. It was already clear. And that leads to the central question behind this whole story. If the king is no longer willing to make space for the son who once occupied such an important symbolic role, then who is stepping into that empty space? Because institutions like monarchies do not leave gaps open forever, they fill them. And the person who steps in next may help shape the future of the House of Windsor for decades. That person, according to this narrative, is James Alexander, Earl of Wessex. And this is where things become interesting. Because to most people outside the UK, James was barely on the radar until recently. He was known, if at all, as the son of Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, a polite young royal, a background figure, someone you might have noticed in a family portrait or seen quietly attending a formal event. Not the kind of person people build headlines around. But somewhere between the closing stretch of 2025 and the opening weeks of 2026, that changed. James stopped being background scenery. Very quietly, very carefully, the palace began moving him closer to the front of the frame. Not with huge fanfare, not with a dramatic announcement. More like a careful institutional adjustment. A slow repositioning, the kind the palace tends to prefer because it attracts less resistance and looks more natural over time. What happened next was the part that reportedly rattled the Sussex camp the most. The public took to him almost immediately, not in a chaotic, viral, celebrity way. Not in the unstable way public attention often works now. It was calmer than that, more solid. People seemed comfortable with him. There was no wave of controversy, no exhausting cycle of backlash and counter-backlash, no emotional roller coaster. He appeared, carried himself properly, and was received with surprising ease. And the numbers, at least according to the account you provided, told their own story. In the first months of 2026, James's public approval reportedly rose in a steady pattern. Not with sudden spikes, but with slow, dependable growth. That kind of pattern is gold for palace strategists because it suggests something lasting. It suggests trust taking shape over time, not a momentary burst of fascination. The press reaction mattered too. British tabloids are not exactly known for restraint, especially where royals are concerned. But James, in these early stages, was handled with unusual softness. No scramble to manufacture scandal. No endless TV arguments over whether he was suitable. He was allowed, unusually, to simply exist in the role he was being given. He attended, he performed, he was observed, and people seemed willing to take him on his own terms. That tells you something. It suggests the palace, the media, and a large portion of the public were all leaning in the same direction. Whether coordinated or not, the mood was aligned. And the mood seemed to say, enough chaos, enough personal drama, enough endless emotional negotiation. What people wanted again was steadiness. Then came one of the most cutting phrases in the entire story. According to the transcript, some palace insiders were privately describing James as a despair that was promised. That phrase lands hard because of what it implies without directly saying it. It suggests Harry was not, in the end, indispensable. It suggests the role he left behind was not some sacred gap the institution could never repair. It was simply a position, a role. And roles in institutions can be filled by people better suited to them. That is a brutal idea if you are Harry. Because for years, part of his narrative rested on the suggestion that the monarchy had lost something uniquely valuable in losing him. But a phrase like that pushes the opposite argument. It says the monarchy did not lose its future balance. It merely had to wait for another figure to grow into place. At only 18, James was even being compared by some inside palace circles to Prince Philip. Not because he had done anything dramatic, and not because he had a record of grand achievements. The comparison was about temperament. It was about bearing. It was about the old royal virtues that the institution values more than charisma, restraint, discipline, consistency, discretion, and a willingness to support the monarch without demanding the spotlight. And that contrast, fairly or unfairly, was becoming sharper by the week. While Harry and Meghan spent the early part of 2026 explaining stalled projects, damaged relationships, and professional setbacks, James was doing the opposite kind of work. Quiet work, small duties, low drama, appearances. The kind of thing that rarely trends online but often builds real legitimacy over time. That contrast did not happen by accident. It looked to many observers like a deliberate recasting of the younger royal image. One model was public, emotional, confessional, brand-driven. The other was controlled, dutiful, measured, and institution first. And as the second model gained traction, the first one increasingly looked like a warning rather than an alternative. But the real turning point, the moment that reportedly convinced the palace that patience had run out, came a little earlier, in November 2025. And if this account is accurate, that was the moment when irritation hardened into policy. Because while Britain was marking Remembrance Sunday, one of the most solemn dates in the national calendar, Harry and Meghan were reportedly attending Kris Jenner's 70th birthday celebration in Calabasas. That detail hits so hard because of what Remembrance Sunday means in Britain. It is not just another ceremonial day. It sits deep in the national memory. It is about war, sacrifice, loss, service, and mourning. It is one of the few public observances that still carries real sacred weight across class and political lines. So when images began circulating online suggesting the Sussexes were at a glittering celebrity event, while back in London, the King and Prince William were laying wreaths at the cenotaph, the contrast was almost impossible to ignore. On one side, London in November. Cold air, dark coats, military music, poppies pinned to lapels, 2 minutes of silence, veterans remembering the dead, and a cancer-stricken king standing in service of a national ritual older than himself. On the other side, California. Lights, champagne, camera flashes, celebrity guests, designer outfits, a birthday tent, and a party atmosphere. Those two images, placed beside each other, created a political and emotional contrast that no spin team could easily smooth over. And what happened next would only make matters worse. Once the discrepancy became impossible to miss, the Sussex team reportedly moved fast. According to the story, they asked Kris Jenner and Kim Kardashian to remove or suppress images showing them at the party. The explanation passed to friendly media was that they wanted to avoid appearing in celebratory settings during a period associated with remembrance and respect for the king and for fallen soldiers. But that explanation carried a problem so obvious that it practically answered itself. If the day mattered that much, why attend the party in the first place? That was the flaw many critics jumped on immediately. If the concern was truly solemnity, then the respectful choice would have been not to go. or to stay briefly and avoid any visible participation, or simply to decline. Simply to decline. Once they had attended, trying to erase the proof afterward did not read as respect to many people. It read as damage control. And to a British audience, that difference matters. Remembrance Sunday is not something people treat lightly. It is inherited, emotional, almost sacred in tone. So from that perspective, scrubbing photos was not repentance, it was branding. According to the account in your transcript, the response behind palace walls was one of controlled but intense anger. The communications team reportedly saw the move as performative reverence from a couple who had spent years publicly criticizing the monarchy, only to hide behind its symbolism when their own optics became a problem. That was seen not as sincerity, but as hypocrisy. Some commentators, like Dan Wooten and Paula Froelich in the version you provided, openly said what the palace itself would never say. In blunt terms, they argued that this was not an act of respect but an act of self-protection. The monarchy's rituals were being used as cover for a PR mess. And this, reportedly, was the point where internal attitudes shifted in a more permanent way. Harry and Meghan were no longer viewed merely as difficult relatives or estranged family members. They were increasingly being seen as an institutional problem, a risk factor, a source of recurring instability. In the cold language of strategy, that means something important. Once a person becomes a liability, the institution stops trying to reconcile and starts trying to contain. But this is where the story gets bigger than the royal family itself. Because many people assume the Sussex crisis is still mainly a monarchy story. According to the script you provided, it isn't. Not anymore. It's also a Hollywood story, and the more devastating damage may have happened in Los Angeles, not London. The key figure here is Ari Emanuel, one of the most powerful agents in the entertainment world and the head of William Morris Endeavor. And according to multiple reports referenced in the transcript, his relationship with Meghan reached a breaking point around Thanksgiving 2025. The details are striking because they sound almost too on the nose. The claim is that Meghan became furious when one staff were unavailable around the clock during the Thanksgiving holiday to manage ongoing issues. To critics inside the agency, this allegedly confirmed the kind of diva behavior that had long been denied or dismissed as unfair rumor. If that account is true, the meaning was bigger than one disagreement. Ari Emanuel is not known as someone who runs from difficult clients. He built a career on managing powerful, demanding people. Movie stars, athletes, CEOs, political figures, people with giant egos and even bigger expectations. That is his world. The friction alone would not scare him. So if someone like Emanuel decides a client is not worth the strain, observers naturally ask what made the relationship so unworkable. Because with a figure like him, the standard is not, are they difficult? The standard is, are they profitable enough to justify the difficulty? And that brings us to the business logic underneath all of this. Major agencies do not make decisions like soap opera characters. They make them like accountants with power. Every client is measured, formally or informally, by a very basic equation. How much attention do they consume? And what do they return in revenue, status, or strategic value? If a client takes constant time, endless management, and heavy internal energy but produces weak returns, the relationship slowly cools. Calls take longer to come back. Deals stop moving quickly. Excitement fades. Fewer people inside the firm want to go to battle for that client. Eventually, the client feels the shift and often leaves in frustration. From the outside, it may look sudden. Internally, it usually isn't. According to the narrative in your transcript, that's essentially what happened here. The Thanksgiving clash was the visible symptom. But the real cause was a deeper calculation. The Sussex brand was producing more strain than value. And losing an agency like WME is not a minor setback in Hollywood. A top agency is not just there to book appearances or chase meetings. It functions as a shield, a network, a pressure system, a source of leverage, a way of signaling to the town that this person still matters and still has heavyweight backing. When that shield weakens or disappears, the client becomes much more exposed. Without that support, every bad headline lands harder. Every stalled project looks worse. Every awkward rumor becomes more dangerous. And in a town that runs on perception, once people sense momentum slipping, they do not wait around politely. They move on. That same pattern, according to this story, appears again with Oprah Winfrey. And in some ways, the Oprah distancing may be even more symbolic than the WME fracture, because Oprah was not just another celebrity acquaintance. She was the platform that helped elevate Harry and Meghan's post-royal identity into something global. The 2021 interview was not a random media event. It was the defining public statement of their new era. It gave their grievances legitimacy. It introduced their version of events to millions. It shaped public understanding for years. So if Oprah is now, as some insiders reportedly suggest, keeping a careful distance, that matters. The explanation given in the transcript is straightforward. Several of the claims made in that interview have since come under scrutiny or been contradicted. The most famous example is the claim about a private marriage ceremony 3 days before the public wedding, which was publicly challenged by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Other details once treated as major revelations have weakened over time under fact-checking and review. For Oprah, that creates a legacy issue. Her entire public brand was built on seriousness, discernment, and emotional truth. If she is seen as the vessel for narratives that later unravel, that is not neutral. It reflects back on her. And someone who spent decades building one of the strongest media brands in the world is not likely to casually absorb that kind of stain. So, according to the version you provided, she has effectively moved them into a kind of silence zone. Not a public feud, not an attack, just absence. And sometimes absence is more damaging than criticism, because Oprah's approval has always functioned like a form of cultural endorsement. When she lifts someone up, doors open. When she stops mentioning someone, the air changes. It does not need a headline. It doesn't need a statement. In elite circles, silence from the right person can operate like a quiet delisting. A figure who once had immense market value suddenly stops circulating in the ecosystem. That is what makes this phase of the story so significant. Two of the most important American pillars supporting the Sussexes' post-royal life appear, in this telling, to have stepped back. Oprah is no longer amplifying them. Mari Emanuel is no longer managing them. And in Hollywood, once both patronage and representation begin to disappear, the road back becomes much steeper. That brings us to the big money deals, the ones that were supposed to prove that leaving royal life could become a fully independent commercial empire. The Netflix agreement, the Spotify deal, the branding, the content pipeline, the enormous expectations. By spring 2026, in the account you provided, those deals are no longer symbols of promise. They are examples of stagnation. Projects once introduced as bold and groundbreaking are now stalled, shelved, or drifting in what the industry loves to call development hell. And then came what may have been the most self-defeating spin of all. Rather than simply admitting that some of the content had failed to connect, or that execution had fallen short, Meghan reportedly began suggesting through friendly outlets that her projects were delayed because she was being so careful not to offend the king. That explanation invited instant disbelief. A couple that had spent years publicly criticizing the institution was now saying effectively that royal sensitivity was preventing a cooking show or similar projects from moving forward. 2. Even commentators who were once sympathetic struggled with that logic. The palace, importantly, did not have to answer. It did not have to deny, rebut, or engage. The contradiction did the damage on its own. And when the palace can win simply by saying nothing, that tells you the argument has shifted in its favor. Part 3, by this point, the issue was no longer just underperformance. It was credibility. You can't spend years speaking openly, releasing documentaries, publishing memoirs, and positioning yourself as someone unafraid to expose the institution, then suddenly claim that your hand is now being restrained by the very standards you previously ignored. To many observers, that explanation did not sound principled. It sounded convenient, and the American audience that once found the Sussex exit compelling had, by 2026, reportedly become much less forgiving. Early fascination had given way to a sharper question. Where is the substance? Where is the work? Where's the consistency? The drama that once generated curiosity was no longer enough on its own. That is why one label became so damaging. Since the Spotify fallout, the word of grifters had begun attaching itself to the Sussex brand in the American press and commentary landscape. Once a term like that gains traction, it does serious commercial harm. Luxury houses, legacy brands, and conservative corporate partners do not want instability. They want durability. They want elegance, predictability, trust, and long-term association. That matters because brands like Dior, Gucci, or Balenciaga are not just buying attention. They are buying aura. And aura is hard to maintain around figures whose public story keeps shifting shape. According to the transcript, those sorts of companies have reportedly declined serious partnership discussions. The charity events that once might have competed for Sussex attendance were said to be quietly backing away. In elite circles, association with scandal can stop feeling glamorous very quickly. But the story becomes even more uncomfortable once the financial pressure enters the picture.